Battle of Gettysburg took place in July of 1863, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. Over those 3 days, the two armies, which amounted to approximately 175,000, left behind 51,000 casualties in just 3 days. That's an entire football stadium full of people. Great emotional trauma occurred here, whether you were killed, whether you were wounded, or whether you survived the battle without a scratch. You knew something important happened. The other reason, I think, and some psychics have said that there are several reasons why they believe spirits linger at a certain place. One of those reasons is fear of judgment. They're afraid to move on. Remember, there was a great Christian resurgence in the 1850s. So many of the men who went to war here knew what they were doing when they were killing their brother man. They were committing a mortal sin, and of course there's that famous farewell when the Union and Confederate soldier would get together in the lull of the battle and trade coffee and tobacco. When they had to go back, they would salute each other and they'd say, "See you in hell, Johnny. See you in hell, Billy." And they were serious about it. They knew they were committing a mortal sin by killing their fellow man. Doing my research for my book on Joshua Chamberlain, Through Blood and Fire, I discovered a lot about the man, in particular how as he aged he became more spiritual. And I think it had to do with his reflection upon his experiences in the Civil War, where he came this close to death 6 or 7 or 8 times. And so I believe that he, as he grew older, got more and more into the spirit world. Of course, it's from Chamberlain that we get our very first ghost story of the Battle of Gettysburg. The 5th Corps, his unit was attached to the 5th Corps. As they were marching towards Gettysburg from Hanover the night of July 1st, there was a strange rumor that came back down through the column. The men in front kept seeing this horseman with a cape and a tricorn hat and on a white horse. And finally they got close enough and realized that it was the ghost of George Washington, they thought, leading them into Pennsylvania, into battle. And they felt this was a positive thing, that they saw the spirit of the father of the country leading them into battle. Many, many years later, when he was an old man, Chamberlain was asked about that incident, and he said yes. He says no doubt. He said it was a superstition. And then he paused for a while and he said, "But who among us can say that something like that can't happen?" McPhersons Woods gets its name from the McPherson family who owned the farm on the ridge, in McPhersons Ridge. And it was the first permanent Union battle line, which was Buford's cavalry drawn out, dismounted along McPhersons Ridge to stop the Confederates' advance. And to the south of the barn, that's the only thing that exists now, is the woods, McPhersons Woods. And there are a number of stories that come from McPhersons Woods. One comes from John Burns, the famous citizen hero of Gettysburg. And my friend Greg Coco talks about it, although he doesn't claim to believe in ghosts, and yet he got this story about John Burns. John Burns was walking through McPhersons Woods one evening around dusk, and according to him, he stopped dead in his tracks, confronted by a Confederate soldier. The only problem was, this was many, many years after the battle. He stopped, he looked at the Confederate soldier, and the Confederate soldier vanished before his eyes. And John Burns, very, very practical man, turned around and he didn't run, but he claimed that he walked very rapidly away from that spot. The letters that I have received over the last 10 years, since I wrote the very first Ghosts of Gettysburg book, I believe have maintained a seriousness throughout. People who have had an experience of the paranormal, it in a way kind of changes their life. They will never look at things quite the same again. Suddenly it's an affirmation that there is something that goes on after we die, when you've experienced something like these people who've written to me have experienced here at Gettysburg or anywhere. As the battle progressed through the morning of July 1st, the Union cavalry was pushed back from McPhersons Woods and McPhersons Ridge. And the very next stop they made, the Union line, was at the Lutheran Theological Seminary, or that segment of Seminary Ridge, the northern part of Seminary Ridge, which would later become the main Confederate battle line. But at this point, Union troops were on it. And the seminary itself, some of the older buildings there became hospitals, scenes of operating surgeons, men being in terrible agony, taken from the surgeons and placed in the cellar or other areas of the building to recover, recuperate. So some of those buildings there actually witnessed some of the most horrible sights in American history. Also, it's through that area that General Reynolds was taken. His lifeless body was brought back from Reynolds Woods, or McPhersons Woods, and brought back right across where some brand new dorms exist now. The story that was told to me came from a seminarian who was sound asleep one night, and about 2 in the morning heard a terrible scream from down the hall. And he recognized the voice as one of his classmates there who had been in the service, and he figured maybe he was just practicing one of his military calls or whatever. So he went back to sleep. About an hour later, he woke up to probably the most frightening image that he'd ever experienced in his life. It was the torso and face and head of a man floating in his dormitory room, not 10 feet from him, staring at him. He began to pray. He opened and closed his eyes several times. Every time he did, the figure was still there. Finally, he was getting ready to defend himself and stand up. He thought maybe this was a real human being. As he did so, the image vanished. 2 or 3 days later, he's walking down the street, and he sees his friend that he heard yelling the night before. And he asked him, what was he screaming about? What's up with the screech? And the fellow said, got real serious. And he said, you're not going to believe this. About 2 o'clock in the morning, I saw a face floating in my dorm room. And the first fellow said, what did it look like? And he virtually, to a T, described the man that the first fellow saw 1 hour later. The strange part is the description of the fellow in a blue officer's tunic, dark beard, dark face, dark hair, is virtually exactly what John F. Reynolds looked like on the day of the battle when he was killed. Cemetery Hill, and particularly East Cemetery Hill, was the scene of an attack on the night of July 2nd by the famous Louisiana Tigers. Advanced across the open fields and attacked. And they got actually all the way up to the crest of East Cemetery Hill. The Union gunners up there, the cannoneers, had to fight them off using the implements that they loaded the cannons with. They got that close that they could actually get into hand-to-hand combat with them. It was fortunate for the Union troops that more Union troops arrived than Confederates and drove them off, so the Union troops did manage to hold that position. Some of the stories there come from our own guides, from the Ghosts of Gettysburg Candlelight Walking Tours. They see, and our customers will see, strange blue lights up on East Cemetery Hill. Some in the shape of a column that seem to come out of nowhere and just appear out there. Some others have heard strange noises coming from the distant woods around Culp's Hill and in the valley between Culp's Hill and East Cemetery Hill. Probably the most unusual, maybe the most frightening, is they will hear volleys of gunfire, musketry, coming from that little valley, almost an echo, only 130 some years too late, of what actually happened down in that valley during the battle. People ask if a person believes in ghosts, and from my experience, you don't have to believe in ghosts. What you have to believe in is human beings' senses. In other words, their sense of sight, their sense of smell, their sense of hearing, because that's what I put in my books. It's what people actually experienced out on the Gettysburg battlefield or in the homes or businesses in Gettysburg that we're worried about. You've got to believe in a person's senses. I mean, that's right here. It's like asking whether you believe in an apple. Well, there it is, right there. Belief is not a part of it. The peach orchard, the fighting out there, that was actually on July 2nd. General Sickles, who was a Union commander here, had pushed his Union Army 3rd Corps out away from the rest of the Union line because he felt he was in a bad position. And he got out there, and his line actually formed a V with the V at the apex of the V was at the peach orchard. And it's a bad position because bullets and shells being fired at one side of the line are going to fall in the rear of the other side, and attacks can easily crumple it. So when Longstreet did make his attack, that was the first to go, the peach orchard. And the men were driven pell-mell through the peach orchard and back into the fighting in the wheat field, which was another area that had tremendous fighting, changed hands half a dozen times. Several thousand soldiers of both sides were left as bloody footprints, basically, in the wheat field there. The wheat was torn down. Colonel Cross was killed in the area. Several other officers were mortally wounded and killed. The fighting there was very, very vicious, very seesaw back and forth. Two stories come to mind of that area. Right in between the peach orchard and the wheat field seems to be the area that is the site of the Phantom Regiment. Numerous times, a regiment, many people feel that it's a reenactment regiment, is seen marching around and doing what they call the evolution of the regiment, the marching and the splitting into different segments of the regiment, the manual of arms. And they're delighted because they're being shown by a reenactment group. They think what the battle looked like. All of a sudden, as they're watching, it disappears right before their very eyes. Some people say to me, well, I've never seen a ghost, or I've never experienced a ghost, so it can't possibly exist. Well, I disagree with that, because there are many things in our lives: hope, love, the thrill of knowing that you've done something right in your heart. You can't touch those, you can't see them, but they exist. Little Round Top became the key to the fighting on the second day. The Union line was in the shape of a giant fish hook. Culp's Hill would have been the barb of the hook. It curved around Cemetery Hill, ran straight down Seminary Ridge, and ended just below Little Round Top. As Sickles' line was collapsing on July 2nd and Devil's Den was overrun, the Confederate line actually overlapped the Union line. It was longer, and Confederate soldiers were on their way to take Little Round Top, which basically would have been the key, a high position where you could put artillery and fire down the entire length of the Union line. It would have been the key to unlocking the door of the Union line. And just as they were about to make their assault, they had halted because they were totally exhausted. The Confederates were, some of them were out of water. It was very hot on July 2nd. And at that time, General Warren saw that who was a commander in that area, saw that there was a problem on Little Round Top, thought he saw Confederates in the woods coming towards Little Round Top, and realized this is the key to the position. He called for reinforcements, and the reinforcements that came up were part of the 5th Corps, Strong Vincent's Brigade, and part of this was the 20th Maine, who ended up basically in the front of the line, which put them all the way on the extreme left flank of the entire Union line. So when the Confederates attacked, they attacked and they ran into these troops, Union troops up there, who'd just been put into position moments before. As the Confederates attacked, their line kept moving over to the Union line's left. Chamberlain, Joshua Chamberlain, the theologian and college professor turned warrior, is all of a sudden in a predicament. He was told by Vincent, hold this position at all costs. He had to double his line, so he took every other man out and stretched them out as far as he could Still, it wasn't enough. The Confederates kept lapping farther and farther around his line. If that wasn't bad enough, all of a sudden, he gets word from down the line that the men are running out of ammunition. They've already repulsed 3, 4 Confederate assaults, and now they're out of ammunition. He calls for the bayonet. The men fix bayonets as the Confederates begin their, what they thought was going to be their final assault, because they heard them shouting too that they needed ammunition. That's how close the two lines were. As they were moving on up, the Union troops under Chamberlain's command leapt from their meager stone wall that they had built and rushed headlong into the Confederates and fought them off at the point of the bayonet, driving the Confederates from that position and eventually driving them all the way down in the valley between Big Round Top, Little Round Top, down towards Devil's Den. It was right after one of the reenactments here at Gettysburg on July 2nd, the anniversary of the Battle of Little Round Top. A friend of mine was out on Little Round Top. He was a reenactor. He took another friend of his just to be out there at the same time that the battle was occurring 100 and some years before. And as they were sitting there on the slope of Little Round Top, no one was in that general vicinity. There were people far away on Little Round Top. They suddenly heard somebody coming up the pathway, or actually making their own pathway through the bushes and the brambles down below them. And he looked, and by golly, there was the best looking reenactor they had ever seen in their life. This guy was, he had the kit right down to everything. He was authentic as you could get. And he walked up to him and he said, pretty hot fight out there today, wasn't it? And they figured he was talking about the reenactment. They said, oh yeah, it was quite a hot affair. And he reached into his cartridge box and he pulled out 2 rounds of ammunition. He said, here, you boys may need these tomorrow, and handed them to him. And the unusual part about it is that it was live ammunition. Reenactors are forbidden, in fact, they're inspected by the National Park Service. They cannot take live ammunition onto the battlefield of Gettysburg. Yet these were 2, and in fact they looked like museum pieces. They had the beeswax around the outside as lubrication. They were tied off. They were perfect in every way to original rounds. The fellow turned around and went down a few steps and then kind of disappeared behind the brush down there. And the 2 fellows looked at these rounds, and the one knew enough about Civil War rounds to realize that these were original rounds that were handed to him. Here at Gettysburg, the paranormal experiences people have here, you have to keep in mind that the traditional image of a ghost is probably wrong. What Hollywood has taught you about what a ghost is probably wrong. These were people at one time, and they were flesh and blood. They had families, they had loves, they had desires, they had hates, just like all of us. One day we're going to be there, and I would hope that people would treat us with that kind of respect that we should treat these people. Of course, they deserve even more in the fact that they died here for something that was very, very important to all of us today. And I think it's important when you come to Gettysburg to remember that, to go out to the National Cemetery, to see not only the headstones of the dead with the names and regiments on them and their hometowns or home states, but also the ones that are just blocks with numbers on. Those are men who gave not only their futures, their lives, their later generations for their country, but they also gave their very identity for their country, which I find is very, very sad. And so that type of human being, that type of man, deserves respect, I think. I'm sorry, I have to see your pass, please. And the Confederate just looked at him in kind of a strange way, disappeared. Next morning, the fellow resigned. Didn't want to be guard out there anymore. And I sat there right next to him while they were taping, and one of them had her hand over her mouth, and the other one was speechless. And I asked him, Is this what it looked like? As they were recreating the woman in white, neither could speak. They just nodded, and I noticed tears were coming down their faces. They're marching along. All of a sudden, they start marching down into one of these swales, and as they got to the bottom of the swale, it had to be 40 degrees down there. It was so cold, they saw their breath begin to condense in this coldness. They looked at each other. They couldn't stop. They had to continue, so they continued on up into virtually the hell-like heat then of the broad open field of Pickett's charge. And she described playing out there with her friend, and they were climbing across one big gap in the rock. And as she climbed over, she kind of slipped a little bit, and her leg went down into this gap. She couldn't pull it back out. Something had grabbed onto her leg. Her friend came over to help her. They both looked down, and she described this particular type of soldier. Ragged hat, shoulder-length hair, ragged clothes, and he was hanging on to her. She screamed. He let go, and both of them then ran out of Devil's Den.